noble ones. What a surprise! You're interested in medieval Europe and medieval England, are you? Well, that is fantastic, because today we're going to talk about monastic life in medieval England. But how did Christianity reach England in the first place? Well, you see, Christianity was becoming a major religion in the later Roman Empire. So it is in 200 Anno Domini that Christianity reaches the Roman province of Britannia. However, in the 4th century, Roman forces withdrew, and this brought back a revival of pagan religions. The Saxons, for instance, were very religious. They believed in the whole variety of gods, for example, Thor, Woden and Tyr. They were very superstitious, and they believed in both ghosts and the afterlife. As a matter of fact, it is widely believed and accepted that the Anglo-Saxons were afraid of ghosts, so much so that they would put weights on the dead and sometimes even behead them so that they would not be able to rise again. So it was in the 7th century that St. Augustine led the Reconversion of England. The way he did that was to pass on Christianity feudally by concentrating on the local rulers. And we don't have to imagine the return of Christianity as something that occurred smoothly, and for example during the death of a king, something that could happen was small lapses back to paganism. Also, another important thing to keep in mind is that the population didn't always welcome the changes. As a matter of fact, they are recorded sometimes to be loath to drop their ancient beliefs in favour of the newly preached religion. Interestingly enough, it is recorded that in some places, actually many places, Christianity tried to adapt itself to the existing local customs and beliefs, absorbing them into its own practices and calendar. An example of that is the pagan celebration of spring, which became Eastertide. The already existing standing stones were carved with crosses, and they tried to associate saints to the holy wells. Probably one of the most famous examples of such is the Thorwald's cross, which belongs to the 10th century, was being made with heathen additions, as this cross tells the myth of Odin and the Fenris wolf. So now that we understand how Christianity entered England and how it spread and how things were organized as far as the founding of abbeys, churches and monasteries were concerned, how did life in a monastery in the Middle Ages actually work? Well, one thing we do need to understand is that at the time, monks and churchmen had a lot of power, even political power. Why? Because temporal rulers of the time feared the power of God and also recognized the power of such religions on the mass. Things started to change dramatically in favor of the expansion of the Catholic Church in the British Isles through the Norman conquests. At the time of the Norman conquest, monasteries were still the only centers of education and art in England, and the Normans brought not only a ferocious style of government, but also helped the church develop with many grants of lands. So what we need to understand is that the land in Normandy was held by Norman nobles, as they were given land by William I. Many foreigners came to England to set up abbeys and priories, most of the times belonging to the Benedictine monks order, who we know traditionally wore black robes. As time passes, we also have other orders, such as the Cistercians. The Cistercians were very different from the Benedictines. They were white-robed monks who were spending much of their time in religious devotions. As the Middle Ages continue, one phenomenon, or something that we see happen, is that most communities gained a new church, and the biggest one among them would gain several churches. Interestingly enough, if we have a look at medieval churches, the way we should imagine them is that they were usually far grander, even more expensive and more elaborately furnished than the house of any of the local lords. But even after the Norman conquest, there was still connection with their pagan past that kept resilient. We can see that through the demons represented as gargoyles driven out of the church at consecration and other pagan monsters. Even green men, which were fertility symbols, were placed or carved as decoration, although Norman priests would have been far less tolerant of them than the native Saxon ones, of course. Interestingly enough, from a medieval peasant point of view, religion would have been both a boon and a bane. Of course, one of the most popular beliefs that we have in medieval times was that peasants needed the blessing and protection, considering its supernatural help through religion, in order for his or their crops to be protected from both floods or drought, and also that they needed protection to keep demons away from the milk cows and save the flocks from disease. Clearly, the church not only offered all this, but also offered the salvation of one's soul from eternal damnation. All of this, however, was charged at a heavy price, the tithe, namely 1/10 the produce accruing from parish lands. Also, the furnishing that we talked about, where the congregation had to provide for those. For instance, bells, ropes, fonts, images, vessels, banners and candles, and pay altarage for feast days and burial services. Interestingly enough, we also have the concept of mortuaries, also called death taxes. It is by 1291 that we have 8,085 churches in England and Wales. More than half the churches had an income of more than 10 marks. 5 marks was considered sufficient to support a priest. The responsible for conducting church business in each church was called a rector. So a church in medieval time has to be considered a focal point in a village or in village life for activities other than worship. The churchyard could be used for sports, gatherings, business. Monasteries and monks provided many services to the community, not only having to do with religious function. For example, running schools for teaching children. Churches and monasteries were the centers of education. Another thing that monks did was copying books and sometimes write them. Finally, another thing that monasteries did was to establish hospitals for the sick and the poor. Monasteries were often centers of education. There were also centers of history, for example, where historical chronicles were kept. But monasteries became extremely powerful and started gathering riches because of the support, for example, of great rulers such as Charlemagne. And this is when, for example, Benedictines started becoming extremely powerful and wealthy. Now, an exception to this rule, so a sort of monastic life which had nothing to do with gathering wealth and riches, was that of the Celtic monks, which were actually suppressed by the Roman Catholic Church, but they were only aiming or seeking for a spiritual life. So we do have a few possible orders, and we're going to talk about these now. We have the Order of Saint Benedict, we have mentioned, the Benedictine. They were the most important organization until the beginning of the 12th century, so around 1100, when dissatisfaction with their ways led monks to form new organizations. In the Middle Ages, if you were to visit one of the monasteries in England, France, Germany or Italy, you would find the monks doing the same things, speaking the same language, Latin, and worshipping the same way. The main element of the rule was obedience, as there were 7 daily acts of worship to be followed. Midnight, 1 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 9 o'clock, noon, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock. Monks will go to bed at around 7:30 in the evening, later in summer, and they will be roused by a sacristan ringing a bell for the midnight prayer. The first psalm was always sung very slowly to allow sleepy heads to reach the service. Those who missed it would have been severely chastised. Another order is that of the cloistered regiment. One of the requirements was that of silence. The brothers had to keep quiet unless they were talked to or needed to give orders. At times, edicts against muttering and mumbling had to be issued. Monks had no possessions, but were later allowed to keep charitable gifts given to them. The final requirement was, of course, chastity. Clearly, these monasteries were founded for political, social, and religious reasons. The way to heaven, through a medieval person's opinion and mind, was through devotion. A social reason for establishing a monastery was the fact that they accepted the younger children of noble families. A typical Celtic-style monastery was nothing more than a few rough stone buildings, probably hand-built by the first brothers, together with a church. Each tiny hut would be a cell where the monk could retire to, working on the fields, raising crops and livestock, living only for God. Two groups of medieval war monks which had some effect on medieval England, which were founded in the second decade of the 12th century, were the Knight Templars and the Knight Hospitalier. We do have to understand, though, that their numbers were few, and their main impact on England was the establishment of prefectories and commanderies. A prefectory of the Knight Templars, for example, would be basically a village and lands where they built a small manor house. These manor houses would be run by a surgeon, but they would also have a church run by a chaplain. Now, these lands and churches, however, were most of the times, not always, but most of the times, they would be owned collectively by all the knights because of the vow of poverty. They would be supervised by a master, and the head, of course, of the order would be the Grand Master. Alright then, lads, well, the Metatron is rather busy at the moment. I think I will take care of the closing of this video. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. So we will see you tomorrow, and in the meantime, I think I'll have a look at his earthly possessions. You know, they might be a distraction for his spiritual path.